Welcome to Module 9. Module 9 covers genetic engineering and performance enhancement. The readings in this module are primarily about performance enhancing drugs, but there is one article that focuses more on genetic engineering. And one of the thoughts I had as I read through these articles was that this segment probably more than any, I think, a Christian perspective really makes a big difference. And when you get into the readings, I think you'll understand what I mean by that, because there's actually some really good arguments in favor of performance enhancing drugs and against some of the common arguments against them. I think if you look at it from a purely logical point of view, and you don't really look at it from the perspective of people being image bearers, and even really what the place of sports and athletics in the life of people, so yeah, I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about that. I'll let you kind of find your own way there and see where that goes on the discussion board. But I think you'll find them again to be pretty interesting. And I think everybody kind of has opinions about these things, but some of the readings really take some interesting angles on the whole issue. So just kind of a quick rundown. The first reading by Simon, what he does is he defines performance enhancing drugs and then discusses the main ethical issues related to them. He talks about consent and how it can create a situation where people feel pressure to use drugs, harm to others, which is kind of along the same lines, like people feel coerced into taking drugs because their opponents are. And so, that's definitely an ethical issue. And then another one he really focuses on is harm to young people. So, if we say it's all okay for adults to use performance enhancing drugs, we still have a problem with the fact that kids can be influenced, and at what point, is that a problem? Simon really makes a strong argument that the use of drugs goes against what sports is all about. And his main point he tries to get across is that it really harms that test of ability that sports intends, because it's artificial. And also he really focuses on the fact that it's not respectful to the person, and so he's definitely making the argument that it's unethical, and he's against it. Brown in the second writing argues really throughout the whole reading that he talks about this idea of it being paternalistic. So in other words, it's kind of like parental control to ban performance enhancing drugs. And he takes kind of an interesting slant and talks about soft paternalism and hard paternalism, and kind of makes the argument that soft paternalism is good. And the definition of soft paternalism would really be like the paternalism of parents to children, because children don't always know what's best for them. So we should be able to, give them regulations about what they can and can't do. And that's the same thing with performance enhancing drugs. But when you do it with adults, it's more like what he would call hard paternalism, which he argues is unnecessary. So, basically the argument goes that you're treating adults like children, when you put any kind of regulations on performance enhancing drugs and all of that type of thing, because they should be able to figure it out on their own. And if we would just let them do that, it would pretty much solve the problem. So yeah, the next reading is by Foddy and Soliscu. And in that article, their main argument is that current drug policy is inconsistent and flawed. They don't really agree that, you know, you can prove that performance enhancing drugs actually harm people, and a number of different things of that nature. They argue that it would be a better plan to take all the money that's spent on drug testing and instead just test athletes for health. And if they can pass the overall health test, you know, then they should be able to perform, and then we don't have to worry about monitoring all the drugs. They go through 7 misconceptions that are out there about performance enhancing drugs, and then they make arguments as to, you know, why there are misconceptions. And again, their conclusion is basically that they make the argument that you should just test for overall health. So if the performance enhancing drugs are being abused or being used at such a high level that they're going to cause a physiological problem, then the testing will identify that. And their argument is that that will be enough of a motivator, you know, for people to use performance enhancing drugs, so to speak, but not abuse them. And so, yeah, they really, you know, in some ways don't make such a strong ethical argument, although their 7 misconceptions are kind of arguments that are a bit of an ethical nature. But in my mind, really, they're taking more of a pragmatic approach and saying, you know, there's really nothing wrong with using performance enhancing drugs. And yeah, then the next article is by Pike, and this is a pretty interesting reading on mechanical doping, it's called. And really the whole gist of his article is he's making the argument that mechanical doping shouldn't even be called doping. And the example he uses is a person who somehow rigged an electric motor in a bike, and so of course was caught for cheating because they had that electric motor in the bike. And when they were caught, then the term that was used was mechanical doping. And his argument is that making a change to the equipment like that in such an obvious way that it's cheating and is going to help the person perform better is much different than PEDs, because PEDs don't, you know, drastically change the nature of the competition, whereas putting an electric motor in a bike drastically changes it to the extent that it's not really biking anymore, but it's a motorized vehicle. With PEDs, you know, he's arguing really that they don't make that kind of drastic change. They affect the person to some extent, but it's really not that great. You know, yeah, that's just really the gist of his argument. And then the last reading is by Brown, and Brown makes the argument that biotechnology should not be limited. And to be honest with you, this article was a little bit hard for me to follow exactly what he was saying, but the gist of it is he kind of argues that using biotech is just kind of like the natural evolution of things. And so we shouldn't really put limits on it. When it comes to sports, there's a couple areas that he's concerned with. And the two areas that he's concerned with is positional advantage and harm to children. And so, he's concerned with those two because he doesn't really think that, doing something like genetically altering children so they get taller is, really ethically right. I wasn't really convinced that he had a good reason for that. I mean, I definitely agree with it, but yeah, he kind of lost me on his argument, is I guess the best way I could describe it. And then, yeah, the other one is harm, which I think, is a pretty obvious one, but he also is not comfortable with any kind of genetic engineering that causes harm. But outside of that, he was kind of making the argument that we shouldn't really put limits on genetic engineering, and it's overall beneficial to the greater society. So it should be beneficial in sports also. But yet at the same time, he does have some limits of what he's willing to tolerate. And like I said, I wasn't super convinced by his arguments, but yeah, I'll be interested to see what you think of it, or what any of you might comment on it, and see if you might have better insights than I did on that one. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of the rundown, and enjoy the readings, and looking forward to the discussion.